Putin is a tyrant. He's been telling us for the last 5 years he wants to rebuild the old Soviet Union. He wants to take Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and probably Romania and Bulgaria as well. That's what he's planning to do. He's on a total war footing. His tractor factories are now making tanks. He's throwing young men, predominantly young men from the east, into the meat grinder that is the Donbass. The casualty rates are the same as the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying, and he won't stop.
Joining me now is former Army officer, chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
And author and economic commentator Grace Blakely is also with her. Grace, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again. Nice to see you.
Good to see you both. Well, look, let's start with the opening statements, for example. Let's go to you, Hamish, first. Do you think this is a good use of 2.5% of GDP, however much that may be?
Well, not surprising as a military person and somebody who's been following the conflict in Ukraine very closely, I absolutely do. In fact, I disagree with the Prime Minister. He said we're the greatest threat since the end of the Cold War. I think we're in the greatest threat position since the end of the Second World War. But unfortunately, since the end of the Cold War, we've hollowed out our defence so much that it is no longer a credible deterrence, and certainly not to Putin. Putin is the threat we must face down. Whatever else is happening around the world, it is Putin who, if he is not stopped in Ukraine, will keep going, and we will be fighting him. So, I'm sure financially this money people would want it spent elsewhere. But, if we are fighting in Europe again, and the way things are happening at the moment, it may well be come November, people are not going to the election booths. They're actually going to the recruiting centres, because if things go badly, we could be involved in a war with Russia. And the way to avoid it is to have a really strong and credible defence, which we don't have at the moment.
Grace, what do you make of Hamish's point there? I mean, pre the invasion of Ukraine, you could be saying, well, hang on a minute, why should we be spending all that money? There isn't, the possibility of a ground war where we need tanks and planes and missiles is very far-fetched. But here it is on our doorstep. We see what happens to a country that is having difficulty defending himself.
Look, I think there is a lot of kind of scaremongering actually going on at the moment when it comes to the possibility of a kind of, global conflict. And we really have to bear in mind that whether or not we end up in an all-out European war in Russia is a political decision. It is going to be a choice that will be made by governments who decide whether or not they're going to try and exhaust all other options before going into an all-out war. So, that political decision will be at the front of people's minds. And it is very important to remember the massive, massive costs that are associated with war, whether that is financial costs or costs in terms of people's lives and social cohesion. And it's easy to forget those kinds of costs associated with the kinds of war that we would be talking about because they haven't been around for a very long time. Now, having said that, it is also critical to recognize that people feel scared. And that is the kind of emotion that Rishi Sunak is speaking to today when he announces this large increase in defence spending. But we have to also ask ourselves, why do people feel scared? What are the clearest and most present threats to the average person in this country at the moment? Most of those threats are not coming from abroad. They're things like if you are seriously injured or you have a serious health problem, you may end up dying before an ambulance reaches you. It's that you may end up dying on a waiting list to receive treatment for, again, a preventable illness. It is the fact that we are living in this context of kind of widespread social breakdown where many of the issues that people are experiencing, whether that's to do with crime, illness, employment, are having a severely detrimental impact on their health, on social cohesion more generally. And that is creating an environment of fear and insecurity. And it's easy for politicians to prey on that fear and insecurity in order to basically kind of stoke up desire for increased defense spending, which benefits them and their friends in the armament sector, rather than actually benefiting ordinary people.
Hamish, what do you make of what Grace is saying? That to ordinary people, there's more danger in their everyday lives for not being able to get an ambulance in time, not being able to see a specialist in time. 7.5 million people are on the NHS waiting list. They're in more danger from that than they are from, for example, not having enough tanks or missiles.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. Of course, Grace and I come from completely different backgrounds and ends of the spectrum. I spent the last 35 years of my life on the battlefields of the war, fighting these battles. So I've seen war at very close hand and how dreadful it is, and how you must do absolutely everything you can to avoid it. But unfortunately, the position we're in at the moment, we only hear today that Russian tactical nuclear missiles have been moved forward to Belarus. People are seeing what is happening in Ukraine. So, everybody wants to avoid war. None of us want it in this country. But unfortunately, sometimes, it comes to you. And quite frankly, if we are at war with Russia this year or next year, the NHS waiting lists, the cost of living, the temperature of the planet could be horrifically irrelevant. And I think the fact that if Grace is talking for the general people in this country, and that is their view, then to me that is pretty shocking, because the only way we can avoid this war is to, as I said, to have a strong conventional defense to make Putin think again, because Putin is a tyrant. He's been telling us for the last 5 years he wants to rebuild the old Soviet Union. He wants to take Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and probably Romania and Bulgaria as well. That's what he's planning to do. He's on a total war footing. His tractor factories are now making tanks. He's throwing young men, predominantly young men from the east, into the meat grinder that is the Donbass. The casualty rates are the same as the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying, and he won't stop. But the only way he will stop is by NATO in particular being determined to hold him. And there is a chance that the US, if Trump gets into power, are going to leave us on our own. So, yeah, I would love to think and say the same way that Grace is, but having been involved in warfare all my life, what I'm seeing at the moment really concerns me. And I think we've got to try and avoid it at all costs. And if that means another 75 billion over the next 5 years, then that is the price we must pay.
So, Grace, from your point of view, what do? You heard what Hamish was saying there. You've got someone who's aggressively, invaded Ukraine. He has made no secret that he's prepared not to stop there. How do you keep someone like that at bay if you're not going to spend on your defence, on your military?
I think the way that these issues are presented, it's always presented to the public as though there is a very clear black and white choice. It's like either we spend all of the extra available cash we have on defence, or, we're going to end up in an all-out war that we will lose, is basically the threat there. And those kind of black and white ways of thinking about the world, and thinking in particular about, the economic underpinnings of geopolitical conflict, are not the only way to look at things. I mean, if you look at the funding that Putin is using to wage this war, and this is a really critical point, not just in terms of kind of armaments, but also in terms of the fact that the people that Putin are calling up to fight and die on the front lines are some of the poorest people in Russian society, and he's paying them large amounts of money to avoid having to call up people in the draft, as they've had to do in Ukraine, paying large sums of money to people who perhaps know they're going to die or get seriously injured, but are willing to take that threat on the basis that they'll have a large payout for their family or for them if they get injured. Where is he getting all that money? He's getting all that money from the sales of fossil fuels. Why is he able to get all that money from the sale of fossil fuels? Because for decades, Western countries have utterly failed to invest in decarbonisation, which has left us dependent upon a whole host of grossly authoritarian regimes, not just Putin, but also if you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at the carousel of oil for weapons spending that goes on between countries like Saudi Arabia and the US and the UK, that is a clear and present threat to global security. So, we live in this world where we kind of allow these threats to grow and grow and grow. We allow authoritarian leaders, whether that's Putin or, Saudi Arabia or wherever, to become more and more powerful. We sell them weapons. We allow them to kind of, pollute the planet and use that money to arm themselves. And we do nothing until the very last moment. And then we say, oh, right, now we have to spend all of that cash that isn't going to go into health spending or indeed decarbonisation on building up our militaries. So there are other ways of trying to disempower Putin. We've had all these sanctions, sure, but ultimately the thing that is keeping the Russian war machine going is sales of fossil fuels. Now, that is something we could tackle today, and we are just refusing really to do that.
Hamish, just before we go, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that. Do you see the connection of what Grace is saying there, that actually decarbonisation might have had a bigger effect in disarming someone like Putin than buying more missiles and tanks?
Well, absolutely not. I'm not quite sure what utopic world Grace lives in. Putin, he's not keeping his war machine going on his oil. That quite rightly is Grace is right there. India and China are buying it. He is on a total war footing. He is putting everything into his armaments. Unfortunately, he is an autocratic tyrant that we have ignored for really the last 10 years. And unfortunately, people like him, people like the Ayatollahs in Iran, people like Kim Jong-un in North Korea are not people who will reason about climate change, about oil, and God knows what else. We all want to be in that utopic world, but I'm afraid, Grace and everybody else, we're not there at the moment, and we must prevent war with Russia at all costs.
Okay, I'm going to have to leave it there. Fascinating to get both of your views. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, our former army officer, chemical weapons expert, and also author of Vulture Capitalism, and economic commentator Grace Blakely. Thank you both for giving us your time.